Thank you very much, Sheri, for joining me today. It's a real pleasure, right, to get you on the screen and have a conversation, hopefully, with regards to a couple of my passions, which are sustainability and supply chain management. So it would be great if you could just give me a little helicopter view of who you are so that everybody who can get a handle on where this is going to be coming from, right?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me, David. It's a pleasure to join. I really enjoyed our prep session and getting to know each other prior to this. So I currently work at IBM, and I am the global sustainability lead for IBM Consulting. So when you think about the offerings, the services, the alliances, the big bets, that all falls under my organization, which is incredible because I'm literally able to wake up every morning and do what I love. And that's building a sustainable world with supply chains and technology to enable circularity, climate restoration, and equity for all. I also have a pretty popular brand, Supply Chain Queen, which, as you know, I'm more of a rebel, less queenie, but it works. So
Absolutely,
I went with it. And then also a podcast that evangelizes a lot of the things that frankly, I feel like we should be talking more about, the future of supply chain, giving folks who are underrepresented or misrepresented a platform and a voice to share, and talking a lot about disruptive innovation.
Fantastic. I mean, that's great. And I think one of the reasons for doing this conversation, Sheri, is because I think without a shadow of a doubt, supply chain is in need of transformation, right? And not even transformation, it's in need of innovation, right? And so I think to have someone like you who has had a career that has spanned through supply chain up to where you are now, with a voice and the opportunity to drive that change, I think it's really interesting, right? And to get that message to people perhaps who don't have an opportunity to sit and talk to you could be really pivotal for some people, right?
Well, thank you.
Pleasure.
That's a compliment.
Right, so we've teed this up really nicely, right? So it better be good. If we can jump into your supply chain management career, why did you get into supply chain? Because you had a really interesting, quite diverse element before you got into it, didn't you? So what got you into supply chain?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a non-traditional career path. I didn't start out in supply chain. It was probably a third or fourth career for me.
Mm-hmm.
I started out as a musician, and I owned a couple businesses. I got into real estate, and I was actually sitting in an IT organization at the time, supporting a CIO who was exited. And someone said, hey, we want to start a supply chain organization from the ground up. And I raised my hand because, again, I didn't know much about supply chain at the time. But what really drew me to it was, first, is the breadth of supply chain. So when you think about just the different functions that it spans, the opportunity to really make an impact. So, over 40% of the world works in a supply chain. And then also how technology can really be used to accelerate and drive the type of responsible and equitable outcomes in the world that we need, especially around like responsible sourcing, fair wage, risk management. So all of that, to me, it was incredibly exciting. It was a bit scary because, supply chain brings in so many pieces of, it's just huge. So is sustainability. And that was one thing that I learned early in my career, is that, I wanted to learn fast, and I wanted to be exposed to as much as I could, just so I could figure out where I wanted to really double down. And being curious, I think, was probably being curious and becoming a super learner. Like those were two things that really helped me accelerate my career. I love the interconnectedness of supply chain, the system dynamics, the integrated process. I love that no matter how much technologists tell us that supply chains are run on laptops, it's really the people that power supply chains. And yeah, I mean, when you look at sustainability, which is another thing I sort of fell into, taking a green value chain course when I was getting my first master's at Rutgers, that I had goosebumps hearing a gentleman named Dr. Kevin Lyons speak about the power of green value chain. And that's when I said, this is what I'm devoting my life to. And there's a natural intersection, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. But I mean, I feel grateful that I get to wake up every morning and I get to work with really, really smart people and do cool work. And we're literally making a difference in people's lives. And that's what matters to me.
Amazing. And I mean, what's the biggest obstacle you've overcome then? Because to start a supply chain function or operation from the ground up is no mean feat. And just as the role you're doing now with IBM is also no mean feat, there must have been some hurdles you've had to leap over along the way.
God bless it. Yes. So, you know, what's interesting, again, just going back and now that I'm in technology, I feel so grateful that I've spent most of my career in industry, because I have that context that it's people. We often get in our own way. And I think, you know, there are a few challenges, the capacity building. So making sure that people understand why. You have to have a coalition of the willing, but you also need very clear scope and commitment from senior leaders. So a lot of big transformations that I've supported, you know, sometimes it wasn't there. You had more of one and less of the other. You really need both. The other thing too is, you know, people have to feel connected to the work. I mean, we're all, especially in supply chain right now, we've been living through this pandemic for the past 2 years. It's been a lot, and there's a lot of pressure to deliver. There's a lot of pressure to deliver customer outcomes, and supply chains are at the heart of all this. We power the world. And I think that the attention to worker well-being, to psychological safety, that was probably, looking back on my career, another space that was often overlooked, but really critical for delivering long-term value, in my opinion.
What do you think supply chain needs to be moving forward? Because I recognize that's a very broad question, right? But we've sort of mentioned previously, supply chain doesn't seem to have innovated, right? It innovates, don't get me wrong, but when you look at how supply chain management is perceived and the part it plays in everything, when you hear about a supply chain transformation, it's geared around optimization, or it's geared around risk mitigation. You don't very often hear innovation. Do you think that's something that needs to happen for supply chain management moving forward? Absolutely.
The other thing is, you know, we need a seat at the table, and that's in the boardroom. I've had conversations with a lot of leaders, and I think that when you say supply chain management, the definition can vary depending on the industry segment and the maturity of the organization. The other thing that's a, you know, confining factor is when you think about strategy versus execution. I think in a lot of organizations, supply chain isn't consulted upstream. They're not thought of as a strategic lever. They're often thought as a cost center. And this just isn't true anymore. And what I've learned is you can have the best plan in the world, the best strategy in the world. And I've supported some pretty big brands in my career. It doesn't mean anything unless you can execute.
Yeah.
So if you're designing, you know, integrated process, if you're designing all of these strategic plans, sometimes those plans are only as good as the people that you invite in the room. And unless you can deliver against it and operationalize it, it's just another plan. So I would like for supply chain leaders and supply chain practitioners to be invited to the table and to have a seat at the table and to be respected as a strategic value lever in business transformation. I don't say digital transformation anymore because, I mean, as opposed to what, like we're analog supply chain. This is just the natural evolution of business. So for me, obviously technology can be a great accelerator. I think when it comes to, and I'm going to use digital supply chains here, but when it comes to this, especially through the lens of sustainability, technology makes it visible, things that happen in the supply chain, like you actually have to be able to see and know what's going on. It also makes a lot of sustainability ambitions actionable. Transparency is huge right now. And you need all of these things to really drive toward what was our plan? Like, what's our vision? And supply chains actually make that happen, supply chains and technology. Absolutely. So, I mean, it's another walking commercial for why I love supply chains so much, and certainly why I love my job at IBM right now.
And you're talking about a seat at the table, right? We hear the same things from procurement, don't we? The CPOs want a seat at the table. And I'm specifically pulling them out because for some people, supply chain is that whole piece, right? It's the end to end. It's the procurement, supply chain, logistics, distribution, and the consumer piece, right? But in a lot of businesses, actually, procurement is set outside of supply chain, and procurement demand the seat at the table. So if you've got the CPO wanting a seat at the table, the CSCO wanting a seat at the table, surely these two peers are absolutely intertwined, right? Because you can have the best procurement deals in the world, can't you? But if you can't, as you said, if you can't execute it, you've got no business. So do you think, do you find, because of the pandemic over the last couple of years, that those two peers are working more closely in tune now?
Absolutely. It's interesting because I first of all, I love procurement because I think the biggest opportunity starts all the way upstream. How you design your products, how the types of decisions that you make, raw material input decisions can completely change your network. Having gone through some pretty advanced LCA training, you see very quickly how important product design and procurement decisions are. And I actually wish that more people championed the value of procurement leaders and procurement practitioners, because this is really where it all starts. This is where the values show up in the first kilometer of your supply chain. When you think about, how you build supplier diversity, into your value proposition, how you walk the talk. There's so much power in that. It's actually, I'm getting goosebumps talking about it because I see the impact that it can have in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of, you mentioned risk mitigation. That's a huge lever. What's your strategic sourcing strategy? Are you sourcing sustainably? Do you understand to the nth tier of your network who you're doing business with? This all happens in procurement, folks. It happens in supply chain too, more broadly. But when you think about upstream thinking, especially circularity and like circular procurement, and like there's so much cool stuff in procurement. I think that they are working closely together. The CPO, the CSCO, absolutely. Because if you don't have the ability to match supply and demand, it doesn't work. No. You can't meet the voice of the customer. So you have to work together. It just depends, like I said, how the organization is set up. When I think that's more critical now too, like how are you flattening your organization and allowing CXOs and communication to flow more effectively and reduce some of that friction, that functional friction that happens. I think they've been pushed in that territory because of the responsiveness and the time to value needed with COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the need for resilient supply chains, right, has become absolutely paramount importance for everybody, and cost no longer was the driving factor, and those that had focused on cost perhaps had come undone quite significantly earlier on in the pandemic. So I think, from the clients that I talk to, which are European, US, and APAC, there's been a massive understanding of the impact supply chain has to that end-to-end piece, right? So that's really good. So look, on to sustainability, because that's a massive driver for everybody that has a public persona by way of a corporation or a political party or whatever. And I think it's very easy to get misty-eyed when someone says, oh, we're doing really good sustainability stuff, and you've got the ESG, you've got sustainability, and actually people try to make themselves sound like they're probably doing more than they can. Sorry if I'm a bit provocative.
I knew you were going to go here.
What are your thoughts, right? Because it's a no-brainer, right? For me, sorry, my opinion is it's a no-brainer. We've got to be taking our opportunity to do, not talk. We must do, right? Why, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, why sustainability and why ESG why is it so important for you, firstly, and how do you think businesses need to start really doing rather than just talking?
So yeah, I think that sustainability is good for the planet and good for business. We've made the business case. It's interesting. There's a guy, Gary Cooper, who I interviewed from a company named Reaply, and we get asked so much, what's the business case for sustainability or climate action? And, it's the biggest marketplace that we know. And when he said this to me, over a year ago, it really struck me. It made me silent, and that doesn't happen often. But he said, Earth is the business case. Being able to walk outside and breathe air is the business case. But if you need more stats, think about the sheer volume of people that were displaced just last year alone due to climate change. So I went to COP26, over 30 million people, and most of those people were women and children. And what a lot of folks don't realize is if we don't step in and get our sugar honey iced tea together by 2100, you're talking about $54 trillion annually. That's the cost. And climate adaptation, that's far more expensive than just holding to 1.5 degrees. So, the other thing too is BlackRock has come out and said that 25% of the world's GDP is at risk in the next 10 years due to climate change. And there's a lot tucked in that. And it makes me think about, the power of circular economy. The Circularity Gap report came out yesterday, and we know that there's a $4.5 trillion market potential. But why aren't people acting? Consumers want sustainability. There's tons of research that shows that they'd be willing to pay more or even choose or switch brands. I mean, it's an overwhelming amount of people. But why doesn't it happen? Why doesn't it show up? We have, you mentioned ESG, tons of regulatory disclosure progress. 38 top economies actually have corporate disclosure requirements now on environmental impacts and social impacts. Biden just came out on December 23rd with very specific requirements around human rights imperatives. And for me, I think where it gets murky is, what's the plan? Like you mentioned, in a provocative way, there's no shortage of commitments, of ambitions, of kick the can carbon emission targets. But how does it show up? How do you operationalize it? And I think that that's part of the work that we do. There's obviously some strategy work, but then also taking these really huge ambitions and then breaking them down into bite-sized use cases, MVPs, where can we use technology? Where is this a capacity building or a people issue? Where do we need tri-sector partnerships or people just collaborating and working better together? So it's all of these things, but really at the heart of it, and this is, I promise I'm going to be quiet after this. I was moving around in my chair uncontrollably because I'm putting my hand up in the air. 75% of the sessions all came down to, we need better data and insights. We need better data. We don't have the data, because if you can't actually visualize what's happening and you can't quantify things and measure them, it's all just a web of assumptions.
How do the big corporations, right? How do they change then, in your opinion? Because it's not a change which can happen overnight, is it? There's got to be some pressure from somewhere, and if the consumers or the people that are ultimately helping grow the business because they are utilizing the services or products, whatever that may be, are demanding it, and it's still not happening, what legislation's not working, right? Because there's a very obvious side to governing legislation where it's looks nice, is nice, but certain areas have a few get-arounds, I'm sure. So it doesn't have to be delivered, but how does that change? It's got to change, isn't it?
It does. I think there is a taxation arm and a compliance arm that helps, but it can't just be through that lens, because I like to think of it as a continuum. And it's also part of maturity when you start to get in sustainable transformation. On one side, you might have regulatory compliance. You can tax the hell out of people. It's only going to get you so far. It doesn't foster the type of trust and value orchestration and collaboration that you need by industry. So that's one thing that I've seen. When you go together, you go further. So there's already been a ton of organization around specific segments. There's been work. We participate in WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is really cool. And WEF. I mean, there are tons of organizations, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but getting in these industry specific think tanks, they're important because what's teased out is something called materiality. So you set your ambition, maybe it's grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals, but at some point, you have to get into the nitty gritty, which is, how do you prioritize by your industry type? What are the key issues that you're facing, and how can you make the most impact in those categories for everyone, including your competitors? And once we get to that point, what you start to see, you see a lot of synergies or symbiosis, where when you start moving into really rethinking your product design, looking at material flows, thinking about networks, sharing secondary suppliers. There's a lot of really cool things that we don't have to get into, but you have to be able to understand materiality and start collaborating with others in your field. I think the other thing that's really important is ESG reporting's hard, and we need to just admit it. It's a hot mess right now. It's very manual. It's 3 to 6 months in Excel. Oftentimes the data, it lacks chain of custody. There's an audit and third-party certification, but by and large, unfortunately, David, it's divorced from your system of record. It's divorced from the transaction. When people are making decisions, they need to be able to, and especially in procurement, say, I understand the trade-offs in choosing the supplier, for example. I need to know how my one teeny tiny transactional decision is tied to our company's brand values and the corporate agenda, and then also my own values. Like, you should be able to clearly have that alignment at the strategic, operational, and tactical level in an organization. So, we covered ambition, collaboration, materiality, ESG reporting. And once you can actually visualize what's happening, that's when the magic starts, I think. A lot of folks, they want to go straight from this compliance lens to optimization. Okay, let's just optimize. Optimize the hell out of it, right? it's interesting because I think that God put this in my path for a reason. I came from that job. And what I found was, it was in Lean Six Sigma training. We would spend months in these projects, optimizing, tens and tens of people on these projects, when what we really needed was design thinking and co-creation. Because, and this is an example that I use all the time, that the continuous improvement of the candle did not result in the invention of the light bulb. So we end up optimizing for problems sometimes that we've designed and complexities that we've designed, instead of just stepping back and rethinking things. Like, what can we do differently? So in between compliance and optimization, I actually tuck in innovation and rethinking. Absolutely. And that's through co-creation, yes. working with specific use cases, art of the possible. I hate that phrase, by the way. Rethinking is what I like to call it. But then moving to optimization, obviously that's important. And then transformation, like, how does it show up? How are you doing cool stuff? Business model innovation, new streams of revenue, obviously advancing towards circularity, thinking about social impact and being able to measure that through the quadruple bottom line. All of these things are a continuum. And at the very end is trust, experience. Do people believe? Do they choose you? The very human emotion. So that's that continuum of, stick, carrot, and then love. Love in the world. Yeah. That's my...
Unilever, right? Let's use them as an example. I mean, they are miles ahead of a lot of businesses when it comes to their agenda and the importance they put onto all of this, right? And if a business that is that size can embrace and, what's what I'm looking for, almost evangelize it, I come back to my question, right? Why aren't others doing it? I think they are. It can be done, can't it? It can be done, but what's stopping them from accelerating at the same pace, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yep. So Unilever's a client. I can't share specifics, but I can share just based on client engagements over the past 5 years, where people get hung up. I think a lot of it is, we've always done it this way. So like I mentioned, oh God, I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. So what happens is, you have a lot of senior leaders who have made some big bets. And a lot of this is transformation, technology transformation, big bets. And other people in the organization who maybe they've developed this strategic point of view that's been adopted and it's not working, but it's the politics of moving backwards and undoing what's been done. Yes, absolutely. So much steps on that. It's like the fabric of an organization. So where I find that people get hung up, it goes back to an earlier comment, they get in their own way of progress. When you allow legacy decisions and politics to dictate how you show up in the world as a brand and define your values, that's what I find often people get hung up on. That's where it happens. Fortunately for us, we're at a real inflection point, especially in supply chain and more broadly, some of the other functions tucked under supply chain. I think Gartner came out with a study last year that said by 2023, half of our workforce in supply chain will be comprised of millennials. We already know the buyer persona of millennials. We know how they show up in the workplace. They're demanding that companies stand up and that they commit to sustainable outcomes and that they actually prove. They have to have documented performance of these commitments. So I think that it's changing because it's a top down. So you have regulatory pressure, you have senior leadership, making certain public facing commitments. And then you have this bottoms up, which Mark Pereira says the buzz at the bottom.
Absolutely. Yes.
The buzz at the bottom. And that, the best talent in the world, because we all know that talent makes it happen.
Yeah.
They won't pick to work. They won't choose your company. They won't work for you. So it has to happen. And that's the inflection point I'm seeing where, even at the SVP, like who really makes the change happen? It's that mid-level of leadership in a company. And I think that the tide is turning. Yeah. So I am hopeful based on what I'm seeing that you have people who are committed to sustainability. They're showing up in the workplace with that mindset, which is a growth mindset. Yes. Everything's possible. And this wave of leadership that's been tied to a lot of these legacy 1984 playbooks and decisions, they're either exited, they're retiring, or, they're just coming to their senses. Like, if we don't act and start, making this real, we won't be in business in 5 years. Yeah.
I mean, the other way to do it as well is, of course, is to say to the board that they don't get a bonus unless they hit certain parameters along that path, and then suddenly it becomes real, doesn't it? Don't get me wrong, I'm not laying it all on the board, but they have a fair bit to do with it, right? I think sometimes it has to be absolutely interwoven, doesn't it, into the very fabric of what's going on within the business, right? To make it go forward.
And connecting the consumer, I think that's the other thing. We talked about collaboration within industry and obviously key trading partners, but bringing suppliers into your journey, bringing consumers into your journey, and giving them that experience end to end. I think that that's another thing that I'm seeing, because that can demonstrate not only customer loyalty, brand loyalty, but even with the supplier experience, when you start getting into really, really cool things, like how do you incentivize the right behavior? How do you get, and I'm thinking of a use case example right now with Yara, the Yara digital farming platform, where you're actually able to give smallholders on their smartphone the intelligence of optimal planting patterns. Yeah. How do you optimize yield? Weather and climate data on their cell phone, microfinancing in-app, being able to track subsidies and incentivize, hey, if you subscribe to regenerative agriculture and its practices, we're going to compensate you for that, for information sharing, cycle time reduction in payment. Like all of these things are happening right now. And I really would like to see, how do we incentivize the right behaviors? Because I mean, in my career, I know suppliers get beat up a lot. All my procurement peeps, we beat up our suppliers sometimes. And it takes a toll. It takes a toll on everyone, iterating to like lowest price. And it's not about that anymore.
No, it's not. No. And you just touched on a little bit there. I was at an event not so long ago, and one of the people that was speaking was from Pepsi, right? And they were talking about how they invest in the smallholder farmers, right? And how they have actually over X number of years cultivated whole new varieties of potatoes for the Walker's Crisps based on their investment in those smallholders and giving them proper it's amazing when you listen to actually how they are building a thriving community off the back of that investment, as well as helping, improve their business. It shows it is absolutely essential to do that, moving forward, right?
Supply assurity, you're mitigating and hedging risk in raw material price fluctuation and inflation. Like you have first party signals typically, and you have a closer, tighter coupling with your demand and supply matching. Like there are so many supply chain benefits from doing this that I think, obviously you mentioned Pepsi, they're doing some incredible work too with RSPO, and there are so many brands doing great work. I think the other thing, David, that why I started the podcast is we need to do a better job of celebrating these stories.
Definitely.
And telling people like, this amazing stuff is happening, and procurement and supply chain folks are right at the center of it.
Absolutely.
I think if people focused more on the good in the world, I'd really like to see that.
I agree with that. Brilliant. Look, I'm going to come on to something a little bit more personal now, right? Rather, let's just ratchet it down a little bit, shall we now, and let people think it's going to be a bit calmer for the next couple of questions. Maybe not with this question. How does it feel to be a female at the top of what has historically been quite a male-dominated function?
Oh no, I knew you were going to ask me that. You know what? It's better than it has been, but we have a long way to go.
Yep.
We have a long way to go. And it's interesting because I've gone on the record. I wasn't, I wasn't someone who was as outspoken in my past. It took me a long time to kind of be confident enough to speak out about things. And social media was a great tool. So in posting and sharing, I think that somehow along the way, I stepped out of my shell, and then I realized, wait a minute, there are so many others like me who feel the same way I feel. And then I can also help them. And like, what's the impact that I want to have? So I think that that's been an incredible journey, but I don't want to give anyone false expectations who's listening. Like, it's still hard. It's still hard for me. I've been discriminated against several times in my career. Sometimes it was around fair pay. Sometimes it was just what happens when you're the only woman on a team in the room in an organization. And it's still an issue, David. I've had less friction. Certainly at IBM, they've been a great champion and ally, and that's one of the reasons that I chose to work here. But yeah, it still happens. It still happens. It's still there. It's still an issue.
and it's amazing. I mean, I've specialized in placing within this environment, right, for 20 years now, and absolutely, I can almost count single digits for the number of senior female leadership positions across supply chain, not so much for procurement, right? But supply chain. But there is some amazing talent out there. And as you just said there, right, it's getting better than it was, but there's a long way to go, right? And I think what we need is we still need people like you actually who have got the caliber and the gravitas to show actually you can do it, right? And you need people, potentially like me and others and peers who can say, there we go, this is the best person for the role, and you need to be taking this person, right? And it is about tying that also back into the ESG, into sustainability, because it's not just about climate, it's not just about carbon footprint, it is about equity, as you said, isn't it? It's about bringing in everybody and giving everybody an equal chance to drive their own career and the career within the business.
Absolutely. You have to be intentional, and you have to insist on making room. And I'm going to be selfish. Okay. As a leader, we're leaving value on the table by not hiring diverse candidates. When I have a diverse team, first of all, there's tons of research that supports this. McKinsey, Harvard, you name it. Diverse teams outperform. This is both through the lens of gender diversity and ethnic diversity.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's cognitive diversity that happens. And I have tons of research to show also that, like, when you have that right mix on a team, you're able to unpack and rethink complexity more effectively.
Yes.
Especially at scale. You're also able to have the customers that you serve represented in the solutions that you're building. We're leaving value on the table. So this is my advice. Be selfish. Hire as many diverse folks as you can, because you will not be disappointed. We also have to work really hard to create inclusive environments. So it's not enough to have that governance, the G in ESG, where you say, oh, we have representation. Yes. Do you have inclusion? Do you have equity? A lot of that's a feeling. Some of it's financial.
Yes.
But do people feel like they're being met where they are? I've gone on the record and I've said, oh, I felt like I hadn't found my voice, when I was younger. And that's BS. Like, I shouldn't have to scream. I shouldn't have to find my voice.
No.
I shouldn't have to scream for inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think that, a lot of, we'll talk about gender diversity. A lot of the women that I meet, really, really bright women, far smarter than me, that I hire, they say, I don't want any favors. I just don't want anyone stepping on my neck.
Yes.
And that's kind of that feeling that I think folks don't really realize. So when you have that moment, half the time, yeah, people can just be jerks, but I say more often than not, it's an education opportunity. It's a bridge. Maybe they don't know, maybe it's an embedded behavior. You think it's a microaggression, but no one's ever stopped to say, hey, that comment you made, or when you talked over me, don't do it again. And this is why. This is how it made me feel. You'd be surprised what happens, the type of change that you can affect in your organization. So be intentional, insist on making room, model the right behaviors, tie it to performance and incentives. And I think that certainly be selfish. You're leaving value on the table if you don't prioritize diversity.
Yeah, definitely. Who's had the biggest influence on your career and why?
My children.
Oh, nice answer.
They have. So I didn't. Oh, this is a really personal question. I don't know why I'm getting emotional. Maybe it's because my kids are home and there's a school day that was unexpected. I didn't think that I would be a mom. So I was a dog mom. And, I thought, like a lot of sustainability advocates do, that there's this sense of like bringing, another life into the world the way it is. And, am I contributing to mass population, blah, blah, blah. But I actually got pregnant. It was an unplanned pregnancy with my first child, Shay. And it completely changed my life, because people always, especially in supply chain, in advancing in your career, they say, oh, what keeps you up at night? And I felt like I was sort of wandering through life, just constantly trying to solve problems instead of what gets you out of bed in the morning. And for me, it was my children. It was becoming a mother. And it gave me purpose beyond measure. And, the work that a lot of us do is really hard. And there are moments where you feel like, oh, God, why am I signing up for this headache every day? Really tough change, like especially with sustainability. There's so much capacity building that happens. And it's my kids, like looking at their faces and knowing that, like, I have to do this. This is for my babies. This is for their babies, and it's for your babies, David.
Absolutely.
And it's really been it's been a North Star for me, and when it helps me dig deeper, really deep. So that's my answer.
Do they know Mum is a superhero? What do they think Mummy does? Tell me.
They know all about supply chain. They know about my daughter is especially sensitive. I actually learned a new concept last week. It's called eco-anxiety. So my daughter's 8. Her name's Ariana. She's in 2nd grade. And she came home from school about a week ago, and she just wasn't herself. And I was like, well, what's going on? And she said, well, I'm just really sad, Mommy. And I asked her why. And she said, well, I'm sad for the planet. And climate change is happening, and so many people, like, they're not going to have food to eat. And I tried not to cry when she's telling me this story. And I was like, well, Ari, it will be okay. And in that moment, I realized that my kids are always listening, and I talk about things. I probably have to do a better job of kind of, explaining and framing when I'm in here in conversations like this, talking about really heavy adult things.
Yes,
But I think when we think about, we talked about worker well-being and mental health and like checking in on people, making sure that people are okay, especially on year 2 of this pandemic. How do we adapt mental health training and support to include eco-anxiety, which is very real, especially for our younger people?
Yes.
So I just want to pause for thoughts on that. Do you see that coming up in your conversations with your kids at all?
Do you know what I do actually? My not so my twins are 12, right? And the boy is not quite so worried about the environment as my daughter. All my boy is worried about is his next football match, right? So unfortunately, it's a different level of conversation. But whenever I'm driving somewhere, for example, my daughter will say, "Do we need to drive there? Can't we just walk?" And she'll and I'll be like, "Oh, well, we probably could do, but she is absolutely, and she's very it's a good question, right? She's very perceptive about the environment, and she talks about climate change, and she talks about, why is this political party saying this on the news when actually this and this and this, and it keeps me true actually, because when she hears me, I guess like you, having conversations, and she can hear me talking about sustainability, and she says, "What are you doing? Who are you looking for? Who are you trying to place?" And this, and I talk through some of the opportunities with sustainability aspects to it, and she's like, "Oh, can I help? Can I help you?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's good, but probably not just yet." It is good, and I think you're right though. I think there is a generation, right, which is a lot more in tune with the future and the impact of the present than my generation and before me, really, who are more in tune with present and past and not so worried about the future. So I think it's a really good point, and I think that's something which will be absolutely critical for them as and when they are moving through their adolescent years into young adulthood. You're going to see I think you'll see a completely different workforce all around the world.
Absolutely.
And I'm quite lucky that my children have got a really interesting perspective on the different parts of the world and the different types of countries, and you can see that has to be encouraged, right, as we go through, because then you get equity. It's no longer us and them. It's no longer, the different barriers or perceived barriers. If everybody is considered in the same manner, then equity becomes a natural byproduct, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We've created a lot of these boundaries and this way of thinking. I am hopeful that it will be unlocked with the future generations, that we will accelerate the progress. 150 years is too long.
Yes.
So yeah, that's such a great story. Thank you for sharing that, David.
No, thank you. You caught me on the hop there.
I'm interviewing you now.
Yes, I won't have you back. Thank you. Listen, it's been amazing, right? It's been really amazing just to get some of your time and some of your insights. So thank you very much for that. And anything that you push out there, I think, is really interesting. When I see you've promoted something or you're attending an event, I know already that there's going to be some proper topics discussed in that event. And this has only underlined that, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So
yes.
Thank you very much, Sheri. It's been an absolute pleasure, right? And I hope we catch up again soon, right?
Yes. Thank you, David, for having me, and thank you everyone for tuning in and listening.